Gut, dann beginnen wir mit der Vernissage zur Ausstellung. Mein Name ist Beat Weber. Ich habe die Leitung der Lehre in unserem Departement Architektur, Gestaltung und Bauingenieurwesen inne. Liebe Gäste, liebe Studierenden, liebe Dozierenden und liebe Protagonisten dieser Ausstellung. Im Namen unseres Departements begrüße ich Sie bzw. euch zur Ausstellungseröffnung und danke für Ihr zahlreiches Kommen. The Road Traveled. Antwerpens Stadtgürtel des 19. Jahrhunderts, 1993 bis 2023. Vor über 30 Jahren, im Jahr 1993, als Antwerpen Kulturhauptstadt Europas war, richteten die Fotografen Hans Bol und Scheldekais ihren nüchternen Blick auf ein weitgehend unbeachtetes Stadtgebiet, den sogenannten Stadtgürtel, das Areal zwischen den Leien und dem Ring, inklusive Eilandje, Scheldekais, Zuid-Viertel und dem alten Petroleumhafen. Mit großformatigen Schwarz-Weiß-Fotografien dokumentierten sie im Auftrag von Open City die urbane Vielfalt und Widersprüche dieses Raumes zwischen Vernachlässigung und Verheißung. 3 Jahrzehnte später, im Jahr 2023, kehrten die Fotografen Bol und Scheldekais zurück. Sie hielten erneut den Zustand des Stadtgürtels fest und erweiterten das Projekt um Orte mit zukünftig zentralen städtebaulichen Veränderungen. Entstanden ist ein beeindruckendes fotografisches Archiv des Wandels, eine visuelle Langzeitstudie über Transformation, Brüche und Kontinuitäten im urbanen Raum. Die serielle Gegenüberstellung der Aufnahmen von 1993 und 2023 zeigt nicht nur, wie stark sich urbane Räume im Laufe der Zeit verändern, sie macht diesen Wandel auch sichtbar und vergleichbar. In einer Zeit, in der künstliche Intelligenz zunehmend Bilder analysiert, klassifiziert und interpretiert, gewinnen solche dokumentarischen Serien eine neue Funktion. Sie werden zu einem Fundus und Reservoir, aus denen sich nicht nur Vergangenes ablesen lässt, sondern auch künftige Entwicklungen modellieren lassen. So wird Fotodokumentation jenseits nostalgischer Rückschau zum strategischen Werkzeug zur Grundlage für Stadtanalysen, partizipative Planung, architektonische Forschung und möglicher Prognosen urbaner Transformation. Der nüchterne Blick von Hans Bol und Scheldekais war ursprünglich der kritische Gegenwartsbeschreibung verpflichtet. Er eröffnet damit heute auch Perspektiven auf mögliche Zukünfte und auf das, was Stadt einmal gewesen ist, um zu verstehen, was sie werden kann. Nun freut es mich sehr, die Protagonisten dieser Vernissage begrüßen zu dürfen. Zum einen ist das Pieter Uitenhove, Emeritus der Universität Gent, Professor Tom Avermaet, ETH Zürich und natürlich die Fotografen Hans Bol und Scheldekais, die ebenfalls hier im Saal sind. Ich möchte die Gelegenheit nutzen, allen Beteiligten und insbesondere dem Institut Urban Landscape und deren Co-Leiterin Regula Iseli für ihr Engagement und der Direktorin Oja Atalay für die Unterstützung auch in pekuniärer Hinsicht zu danken.
Vielen Dank, Beat. Auch von meiner Seite guten Abend und herzlich willkommen. Ich freue mich sehr, dass ihr so zahlreich gekommen sind und ich freue mich vor allem auf diese wahnsinnig wunderschöne Ausstellung. Ich beginne mit den Fußnoten administrativ. Ich mache die Einführung auch auf Deutsch. Die Vorträge, die beiden werden auf Englisch sein. Wir hören uns hier die Vorträge an. Wir bewegen uns dann zur Ausstellung, wo wir uns eben auch bei einem Apero die Bilder dann anschauen können. Das Autorenteam dieser Ausstellung ist dreiköpfig. Neben Peter und den beiden, Peter Uidenhofe und den beiden Fotografen, darf ich euch bitten, schnell alle aufzustehen, damit die Leute euch auch sehen. Das sind die Autoren dieser Ausstellung. Vielen Dank. Und wir werden von Peter Uidenhofe, der Professor für Theorie und Geschichte des Städtebaus war, auch Verantwortlicher für das Masterprogramm und Head des Departments in Gent. Wir werden von ihm hören, wie diese Ausstellung, wie diese Fotografien entstanden sind, ihre Geschichte, ihre vielleicht auch Schwierigkeiten, ihre Herausforderungen und was das damals und heute bedeuten. Und ich möchte es nicht unterlassen, ganz kurz auch einen Dank an die Stadt Antwerpen auszusprechen. Sie sind nämlich, die Stadt Antwerpen ist Besitzerin dieser ganzen Sammlung. Es gibt noch viele mehr von diesen Fotografien. Dem Stadtbaumeister Christian Rapp, dass wir die Fotografien ausleihen durften und seiner Mitarbeiterin Valerie van der Velde. Das ist der erste einführende Teil und ich begrüße als zweiten Gast ganz herzlich Tom Avermaet. Er ist Professor an der ETH Zürich, auch für Geschichte und Theorie des Städtebaus. Und seit August ist er Dean des Departements Architektur. Gratuliere. In seiner Lehre und in seiner Forschung konzentriert sich Tom und sein Lehrstuhl auf die Forschung der verändernden Rollen, Ansätze, Methoden von Architektur und Stadtplanung. Und ich habe ein paar Arbeiten durchgesehen, die an seinem Lehrstuhl entstanden sind oder entstehen. Und wenn ich so die Titel lese, der Blick des reisenden Architekten, Fotografie aus dem Blickwinkel des fahrenden Autos oder die architektonische Kompetenz in einer gemeinsamen Welt oder Codes and Convention for Future Zürich, eine propositionale Planung, Annäherung für eine qualitative Verdichtung oder Städtebau als kulturübergreifende Praxis. Und das sind nur wenige, die ich da vorstelle, sind alle auf dem Internet. Und ich finde, dass die Themenvielfalt und dieser spezifische Blick aus meiner Sicht extrem gut zu dieser Ausstellung passen, die diese quasi die professionelle Sicht auf diese Zeit wirft zwischen diesen zwei Zeitschnitten. Und es ist nicht ganz unwichtig zu wissen, dass Tom Avermaet aus Antwerpen stammt. Hat also die Geschichte, die Veränderung, die Umbrüche der Stadt nicht nur als Profession, aus professioneller Sicht miterlebt, sondern eben auch als Bewohner und als Bürger dieser Stadt. Ich möchte nun gerne Peter Uidenhofe bitten und dir das Wort geben. Vielen Dank.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry to speak in English. I understand German and I speak a little bit German, but I prefer to speak English. It will be better for you also to understand. We are very happy with Georges Charlier and Hans Bol to be here and to be invited to present this exhibition. We are very impressed by your building here and your school. It is absolutely a marvelous place, and we would wish to have something also like this in Belgium. So let me give you a short introduction to the exhibition and to the process of production of this exhibition and of course, of the photographs, although I will not go into the details of the photograph and neither on the technique of the photography. This will be rather a topic on the 1st of December when there will be a second symposium like today. The exhibition was or the photography campaign of 1993 was made in the context of the cultural capital of Europe in Antwerp in 1993. That was, from a major point of view, oriented towards art. Art was the emphasis, and in a certain way, architecture and urban planning was a little bit at the side of the architectural orientation of the cultural capital. This is the city of Antwerp. It is a little bit on the side because the north is to the left. Yeah, this is the historical center of Antwerp in between the Spanish fortifications. And this is a new extension made in the 19th century. And this is what we call the 19th century belt around the historical center. And this was filled up in the 19th century and then most of it in the 20th century by at once popular neighborhoods and also bourgeois neighborhoods. Today, the north is now in the up the picture. Antwerp is the 19th century belt is completely filled up, and also the agglomeration of Antwerp is largely going over the fortification of the 19th century. In 1993, at the moment of the cultural capital, the 19th century belt was at a turning point, as was the whole city of Antwerp. The whole city of Antwerp was changing the face because the harbor of Antwerp, which was situated here and in front of the city on the quays, left the city to the north. And so there were almost no ships anymore and no activity. There was also an economical growth, so that a lot of the people were going out of the city to other neighborhoods out of the city. And there were new populations coming in these neighborhoods. There was a lot of abandoned buildings, then there was a lot of economical downgrowth, and there were some social problems also. So the cultural capital of Europe was for the program for architecture and urban planning that I was coordinating at that moment in '93. The occasion to look to the 19th century belt and not to the center. The center was like the feast of the cultural capital, where you have all the big museums, where you have this historical house of Rubens and all these beautiful things. So we thought with the cultural capital that this is the occasion to work on other neighborhoods, which were much more problematic. Also at that moment, there was a competition made at the end of the 80s, where there was a big urban project here in the making at the moment of the cultural capital. Yeah, this is again Antwerp. So one of the points of the program was a photographic campaign, because there was at a certain point no vision, no image of the 19th century belt. This was always forgotten in a certain way, and there was very, very few imagination, very few perception of that area. So one of the points of the program was to ask the photographers, Hans Bol and Georges Charlier, to give that 19th century belt a face, an image, perception. And not in the way to go and to look for the most famous buildings, but to go and take the urban landscape, to take pictures of the urban landscape and to give a kind of a large vision of that area. Hans Bol and Georges Charlier that you see here choose to work with a very large photographic camera. I will not go into details, they will tell about this themselves, but it was very impressive and with very large negatives, as you can see here on this on the screen, where the negative plates are how do you say that? Enlightened. So I give you some of the images of that campaign in 1993. As you can see, a lot of neighborhoods were downgraded. There was abandoned houses, and the city was not very happy with neighborhoods, especially in the north of the 19th century. This is a vision on the Galt at that moment, with some roofs. And so at the end of the year, of the capital year, cultural capital year in 1993, we decided to make an exhibition about the pictures of Hans Bol and Georges Charlier. And we did this in this abandoned warehouse in the north, in a little harbor at Eilandje, as it is called. It was a beautiful exhibition with kind of a walk from the basement until the higher floors in a kind of empty space. There was a lot of enthusiastic reactions, and the people had also the impression that they had a kind of a new kind of a discovery of a part of the city that was almost unknown. But it was the end of the cultural capital, and it was also the end of the photographic campaign. It was not published, and the pictures disappeared, or were given to the photo museum, and in a kind of a way disappeared in the archive of the photo museum. So 30 years later, with Georges and Hans, we once went back to Antwerp, because we are not living in Antwerp, but we love Antwerp, we like it. And we said, what happened in 30 years? And so in a kind of an almost impulsive reaction, we said we should do something with the pictures and do something with this impression we have today. So we decided to make a rephotography campaign in 2023. Of course, the choice of the camera was different. It's now digital camera. And also with other means and tools like this GPS that we were trying to use, but we abandoned the GPS because now it's much more easy to use your iPhone to get the coordinates. And so we had to look for the exact places of the pictures of 1993, which was most of the time quite easy, but sometimes not so easy. So we came in very derelict places sometimes, but also in 30 years' time, there was a huge changement in the urban policy that will Tom talk about. And the urban policy was focusing on the 19th century belt to make a renewal of the most problematic neighborhoods. And so if in 1993 there was no focus on places that were, I mean, there was no project, so we could not choose for places that would change. It was unknown. But a lot of the places that were photographed by Hans and Georges have been changing a lot in 30 years. And so that was a kind of a revelation. Also very interesting for the people of the city of Antwerp. And that's also why the Stadtbouwmeester, Stadsarchitect Christian Rapp, bought the collection, and he was actually kind of missioning the collection that was made in 2023. And so the collection, the panels that you see in the exhibition now belong to the Stadtarchitect. So places in 1993 that we went to again were very difficult to find and were impossible to rephotograph. For instance, this place that you saw before, the void was built up with new houses, and the camera stood in front of a wall. So there were some impossible places to rephotograph. Another impossible place to rephotograph is this beautiful panorama near the South Station, the Central Station in Antwerp, which was taken on the Zuid-Viertel hotel. And a couple of weeks after the photo taken, the hotel burned out, actually, with a lot of people died. And so the neighborhood, which was already a little bit derelict, as you can see, was demolished, and they built up complete new neighborhood here with a new part of the station over here. And the place where Hans Bol was standing on the roof is now impossibly to to reach again. Another place here is in the harbor in the north, 1993. And we see in 2023, there is some changements. So the big warehouse, for instance, was demolished. There are windmills coming up and so on. So you can make a very deep analysis of the changements, which are due to evolution, economic evolution, but also due to decisions of the municipality. Like here, for instance, standing in the north at the old railway yard, which was then changed in the Parkspoor Noord by Secchi and Vigano. And this is by coincidence that this was taken and that the park then appeared 30 years later. And this is the standing point, actually. Another point here, which was very problematic, this is a flyover, and it was very hard to find again, almost impossible to know exactly the standing point. But just take this detail into mind here. This is the sewer pit. And so we were looking around and we find again the same sewer pit over here. And this was our salvation to take again the picture, which is now completely changed. Eilandje harbor is being renewed by some of the towers by Diener and Diener. And here you see part of the sewing pit over here. So the whole harbor is at a renewal point for a new park. This is a standing point, actually. Another point here, also by coincidence, this is a silo at the end of Willemdok, I think. And it was also very hard to find exactly the spot, because what came 30 years later is this now famous building of Sahadid. And we were happy to find this little mark here. I just go back just to, you have to believe me, to know exactly where we had to stand to know where Georges was standing 30 years before. So I go over very quickly some of the views of 1993 with one of the posters of 93 over here. Yeah, the poster says, what is mooi, what is lelijk, means what is beautiful, what is ugly. That was one of the slogans of the campaign of the cultural capital. And of course, it's very applied to the picture itself, of course. This is the beautiful royal warehouses under demolition to be replaced by a very ugly building of Richard Meijer. This is a rail yard, which is now completely built up with towers and apartment buildings. And this is the viaduct running through Antwerp in 1993. And this is the rephotography. So you can see some of the places, you can see just some conjunctural changements, parking meters and so on. But like here also, more trees and then some a fuel station changed into a cafe, also very typical. And then a street that is only changing because of some of the... There's a lot of green that came in the 30 years. And but for the rest, the street is changing in the people who are living there and the activities, but not so much in its visual aspect. And then some aspects of the renewal, like this warehouse here. You just recognize a series of facades here. That was replaced by a housing building. And then these buildings in 1993 were already abandoned and blocked. And they today look like this with some different apartment buildings. And then the viaduct of the railway, which is renovated with shops and boutiques, workshops underneath. This is at Eilandje, the little harbor in the north, which is now a kind of, how do you call this, yeah, for lofts and how do you call this again? I don't find a name, but you can see that these old warehouses here are changed into housing and nice lofts and so on, and which made Christian Rapp and the burgomaster of Antwerp actually say, we should not do this again anymore. I just say this as an anecdote, but so you see that the pictures not always reflect a kind of a positive transformation for people looking at them. This is a viaduct that was just demolished and changed by a fake canal, a water canal that you can't see here, but there is one. And then you see the green here that was an interesting spot for Georges who loved flowers and wild green. It was changed into a concrete desert. And then you have these cellars of the harbor that is now changing into a high-rise apartment building, housing district. This is part of the TGV in the north of Antwerp that came out under a tunnel under the city, coming out here from Central Station, and then some places that did not change a lot. Yeah, this is the campaign of 2023. I forgot to say this. Okay, some other places that will probably change. The Petroleumhafen harbor in the south. This is a station on the peripheral ring roads, and then sluice that is up to be changed in the future. So with this new campaign in 2023, that was we decided to make an exhibition again. And a book this time, and this is the selection that is made between the pictures. 120 pictures were chosen out of a collection of 322 photographs. So it's a huge collection, and those 120 pictures are indicated on this map here. And luckily, the building that we used in 1993 for the exhibition was renewed by Paul Robrecht, but one of the floors was kept in its original situation, and that's the floor that you see here. And so we asked, the building became the City Archives of Antwerp, but this floor was kept as a kind of witness of what it was before. And so we asked to do the exhibition here, and we got the approval to do it. This is a plan of the exhibition with 45 panels. They are recto verso pictures at both sides. So it's much bigger than what you see here in the Winterthur. It's almost double size. And we used the same technique of screens, translucid screens that were very hard to hang up. And then this is some of the aspects of the exhibition. So these are the same plays that you have here now in Winterthur. And then we made this portfolio with a selection of 180 pictures with pictures of 2023 and the maps, texts, and also rephotography. And everything is not shown here. It's a big box that I want to show because we are very proud on it. And some people are interested, it's also for sale. There are only 30 exemplars. Can I say this? Boxes for numbered, individually numbered, that are for sale, and 1/3 is already gone. There's also a website with all the places on the website. So if you click on the star, you get the picture and you can blow it up over the screen, and the computer in the exhibition gives you all the places, so that 322 places in Antwerp. So that's what you see. If you click on it, you get the picture here. If you click on the picture, you get the full screen. And also the map and the picture of 1993. The whole collection of 322 pictures is offered to the City Archives of Antwerp. And so you can consult all the pictures on the website of the City Archive on your computer if you like. And this is a rephotography of our two photographers. On the same spot, you can recognize the window over here. But the road traveled is more about the difference, the time difference between the two pictures than about the urban renewal that you can see in Antwerp. Okay, that is the end of my talk. And I just want to offer to the department here, architectural department, one portfolio. And can I give this to Regula? Please.
Well, perfect. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I feel a bit humbled, I must say, to be in the presence of great photographers here tonight. And after, I think, the impressive introduction of Peter to understand what this big project that is on show was about. But nevertheless, what I will try to do in my lecture of today is to give you a bit of a context, I would say, a context for all of the changes that you will see in the photographic exhibitions, and to understand how these changes were at least partially also the result of a changing urban politics. As Regula was already saying in the beginning in her introduction, I'm not specifically a specialist in the history of Antwerp, but I am a citizen of the city of Antwerp, or was for a long time, and I would also say an engaged observer of that city, and that's the sort of position that I take here tonight. I also want to thank the organizers, of course, of this event, particularly Regula Iselli and Maxime Zauch for inviting me. So let's kick off. I would like to start my talk of today with this picture. It's a picture of an installation of the Belgian architect Luc Deleuze of 1981, as you can see, who at that moment inserted a crane which we normally would see vertically in the city related to the harbor, and indeed inserted it horizontally, as you can say, within a big warehouse. The visitors of this installation were confronted with the enormous scale of these harbor structures, like these cranes. And this was part of a wider artistic project in which the large-scale modern harbor infrastructure, including scales and electricity pylons, were confronted, I would say, with the everyday scale of the spaces of living in the city. What I would like to argue today is that this confrontation with the logics, the scales and the spaces of the harbor, that would in the 1990s, the early 1990s, let's say, provoke or propel the emergence of a new urban design culture in the city of Antwerp. An urban design culture that, to my taste, had one very specific aspect, that is that it focused on public spaces and would, let's say, generate a variety of understandings of what public spaces in a city, a late 20th century and a beginning of 21st century city can be about. In order to make the point that I want to make, I think it's instrumental to take you for a moment to the history of this city. The history of the city, which is of course a very long history starting in Roman times, but I won't bother you with that. But the history which since the 16th century was indeed the history of a city placed along a river and playing a very important role in international trading of goods. Particularly for the Portuguese, Antwerp was one of the main shipping bases where indeed spices from Asia were, for instance, traded with textiles and metal goods. And the point that I want to make here today is that mercantile understanding of the city also affected the form of the city, the forma urbis of the city. Already in this representation, which is indeed a 16th century representation, if you look carefully, you see, of course, that there are big quays and even a sort of docks, you could say, in which indeed all of these mercantile practices could go on. Quays and docks were from the 16th century part and parcel of the urban form of the city of Antwerp. And even if we look, carefully, for instance, at these types of engraving, we see that these docks were enormous and that they had a large effect on the urban form. This was true in the 16th century, but this was also true for the Renaissance city. Please have a look to the right-hand side, the so-called new part, or the new city, as we were calling it then. And there you see that intramuros, within the walls of the city, there was a very large harbor infrastructure, a harbor infrastructure of canals, of docks, and so on. A harbor infrastructure which was carefully designed, of course, for goods to come into the city, but also for goods to be stored in the city and goods to be traded in the city as well. And indeed, if we look at these engravings, again, look at the right-hand side, this new stad, as we were calling it, but also look at the top, where you see that the whole city was indeed developing in function of this trade. Typically, I mean, these are of course slightly later cities. Antwerp would have looked like that. Canals, which were called Leien or vliets, for those of you who understand Dutch, with, of course, an infrastructure to load and unload the ships, big quays on which goods could be stored, and warehouses. That's what you see in the back. This would be typically the image that you would get already in the 18th century, and try to imagine what sort of a big public spaces we are talking about. This was true in the 18th century, but this would also continue in the 19th century, when indeed Napoleon Bonaparte was ruling our areas, and indeed continued to invest in this shipping infrastructure. In the shipping infrastructure, which you now see in the north of the city, if you look to the image to the right-hand side, and indeed two important docks that were now disconnected from the river Scheld with a lock. This was the first lock that we had in the city. Again, docks that were built in 1811, 1813, and indeed had, as you can see maybe from these aerial photographs, but also from the photograph here to the left, had an enormous impact on the form of the city. The city was thought from this mercantile perspective well until the 19th century. And then in the middle of the 19th century, another sort of infrastructural logic, which also had to do with the shipping of goods, was added. And that's what you see in yellow. I just need to also look at the pointer. You see that now this enormous dock infrastructure, these are the Napoleonic docks, but you see that when we move into the 19th century, other docks, again, intramuros, were added. And now we see that these docks, they are complemented with a rail infrastructure. Belgium was, since 1830, had railroads, one of the first countries who had railroads on the continent. And now big railroad yards were indeed added to this first water infrastructure, we could say, both to the north, this is the north of the city, and to the south. At the same time, the quays, which you saw in a more sinuous way, let's say, previously, at the same time, the quays were straightened in order to be able to load and unload ships. So again, if we would have looked at Antwerp in the second half of the 19th century, we would have found in the south these kind of docks in the middle of the city, complemented by these enormous fast railroad yards. And if you would have moved to the north of the city that I pointed to before, again, you would have found, this is at Eilandje, the so-called islet that Peter already mentioned as well, you would have found these enormous spaces which were all dedicated to, on the one hand, the ships, which you see to the right-hand side, the goods, and then, of course, the train infrastructure, all sort of knotting them together and determining, in my mind, a large part of the city. Again, now we are in the north. These are the Napoleonic docks. And you see that we're talking about vast areas determining the city. Areas that had to do with the railroad, areas that had to do with the shipping, but then slowly also areas that had to do with maintaining this whole shipping industry. These are so-called dry docks, which also, made an important or determined an important part of the city. This was the late 19th century and the beginning of the 21st century. That's how you would have found Antwerp. And as Peter Uitenhoven was already explaining, then something after the Second World War, a big change was happening. Following logics of mass production, mass distribution and cargo shipping, suddenly the harbor was moved to the north of the city. These are these vast docks of which Peter showed already some aerial photographs. These are the Napoleonic docks that I showed you before. And these are the vast, enormous docks which indeed relate to this big new scale of mass production, mass shipping and cargo shipping. Meaning that the whole, that the city center itself, with its very elaborate and large-scale infrastructure, now became desolate because all of the shipping was going on in these new docks. And what then typically happened is that these types of docks, these are the docks in the south of the city, they were turned into these kind of conditions, dumped, and indeed now places to accommodate a new urban actor that came onto the stage in the second half of the 20th century, namely the car. Or indeed, that the case they became desolate. What used to be spaces for shipping and storing goods now again became spaces that were reinterpreted to house the vast amounts of cars that came to the city. Or other spaces of these once thriving harbor infrastructures like the warehouses, which became a sort of ruins, we could say. Hard to imagine that they would even survive or that they could have a value beyond their shipping function. So I think what happens in this second part of the 20th century, let's say from the 1950s, from the 1960s and onward, is indeed that by the end of the 20th century, by the 1980s, this confrontation with the logics, scales, and spaces of this harbor, which was no longer a harbor, we can say, indeed started to propel the emergence of an urban design culture. An urban design culture that was in Belgium much needed because there was very, very little tradition in planning the city. The planning of the city of Antwerp was always had always been a very pragmatic thing. There was no big, like in the Netherlands or in Germany, a big planning culture. In cities like Antwerp and other Flemish cities, planning had always been something extremely pragmatic, reacting to the needs of the day. But what we do see in the late 1980s is indeed that suddenly an urban design culture is emerging with a big focus on public space. And this is based on a private initiative, we could say. A private initiative which was called Stad aan de Stroom, a group of people, architects and urban designers, who took a private initiative to start thinking about the future of the city. Again, this city from which all of the harbor activities had disappeared. This was a non-profit organization that immediately collaborated with the city government of Antwerp, and they took two very important points of departure. One, that when they were developing visions for the city, that these visions should be based on a sort of consensus. The different stakeholders should be involved in these visions of the city. So no utopias, but visions that could be implemented, let's say. And secondly, that these visions would not be articulated ex abstracto, but that they would be articulated through concrete urban design projects. the parts, the areas that these initiatives wanted to focus on, the Stad aan de Stroom initiative wanted to focus on, were exactly some of the areas that were in the outskirts of the city, of which we already have heard before. It was about the Eilandje in the north, where these Napoleonic docks were. I don't see my pointer, but well. Anyways, it was at the Eilandje on the north where these Napoleonic docks were. It was about the old quays where all of the goods were shipped to the west of the city. It was about the south area where there were also docks and a big rail side, Spoorzaad. And it was about the big rail yards which you see in the north of the city. All of places that had become vacant and now suddenly became indeed the focus of a new sort of urban design thinking. What the Stad aan de Stroom initiative did is that in 1990 they organized a competition, a big international competition. On the one hand, an open call, and on the other hand, indeed invited design proposals that were commissioned to very well-known offices at the time. For the south area, it was Toyo Ito and OMA. For the case, it was Bet Gali and a local architect, Bob van Reet. And for the island, for het Eilandje, it was Manuel de Sola Morales and Yves Lyon. The result was indeed a very big set of ideas, and then next steps were taken towards very concrete projects under the leadership. Oh, I'm going a bit too fast. Under the leadership of Manuel de Sola Morales, which was assigned as a sort of general coordinator of these new projects. The first area that was focused on through a very concrete project was indeed this area of the so-called islet at Eilandje, an area with a lot of docks which were indeed out of use. And on the island, I think that indeed Manuel de Sola Morales proposed an idea of understanding public space and relating the public spaces of that old harbor area to the network of public spaces in the city. The way that Manuel de Sola Morales was doing that was in a twofold way. On the one hand, he suggested to densify the areas around the former urban docks. These are the urban docks. These are the Napoleonic docks. These were some other docks that were made later on. And the Sola Morales was suggesting to densify this area, to make, again, you could say, blocks and streets in that area that would maybe connect to the city center, which you find below. Maybe I should go one time back, because this is quite important to understand that this is, of course, the historical city center with its fine-grained morphology, and that this was this islet with these big open spaces for shipping and so on. So one attitude or one proposal of Manuel de Sola Morales was to make streets and blocks again, as you can see, by densifying the city. Another proposal, and possibly more important, was indeed to make a new sort of axis in this old harbor area, which would connect the historical city, which would be located here, with this new harbor area. And the way to do so was by introducing lighthouse projects. The lighthouse projects are all of these projects that you see along this axis in black, in dark black. This is one of the sketches of Manuel de Sola Morales, the whole harbor area to the right-hand side, the historical city to the left-hand side, and then you see these lighthouse projects which in some kind of way reconnect the public spaces of the historical city to these vast public spaces of this whole old harbor area. One of the central points that Manuel de Sola Morales indicated as for these lighthouses was indeed this middle ground between these two Napoleonic docks, which you see here. A middle ground of which he gave a very particular role, and which indeed, and later on, about 10 to 20 years later, was realized as a so-called Museum aan de Stroom, one of these lighthouse projects. The historical city is here below. The 19th century extensions with all of the docks you see here. These are the two towers of Diener and Diener that Peter Uitenhoven also spoke about. And this is indeed this axis which is indeed connecting these different public spaces. In some kind of way, leaving the scale of the public spaces of the old harbor area, maintaining them, but nevertheless connecting them to the small-scale public spaces of the historical city. And meanwhile, of course, also making a reinterpretation of some of the infrastructure that was, for instance, along the quays of the docks. As you can see here, some of these sheds which were already there, or other sheds along the Kattendijk dock. This is the Dit project again, allowing them to be used temporarily in a first instance. And then now more recently turning them into something permanent. Again, maintaining the big scale of the public spaces of the old harbor area, but making them part of the everyday life of the city. For instance, here, repurposing some of these sheds as spaces for festive activities, for play, and so on, as you see here as well. So a first area, this northern area of the island, developed by Manuel de Solá Morales. The other immediate project that was started in 1992 was the project for the so-called South, and this was not in the hands of Manuel de Solá Morales, but in the hands of the Japanese architect Toyo Ito. Toyo Ito, who, unlike Manuel de Solá Morales, didn't suggest to keep the big scale of these old harbor areas, but came up with a completely different attitude, a suggestion to make a sort of new urban fabric, a new weave, we could say as well. These are some of the sketches that Ito made, suggesting a new sort of urbanity that has no longer a conventional notion of centrality, main public spaces like a square or a street, nor a conventional notion of public space, streets, squares, alleys, and so on, but a sort of urbanity that is made up of strips. Here you see one of these strips, and then another strip, an open strip, another strip. This is what Ito was suggesting. Ito suggested to reuse the old docks as a big public park. These were the docks that you saw before with all of the parking spaces on top of them, and suggested that in the extension of these docks to make a new urban area that indeed didn't have this conventional idea of an urban fabric with a main central square and secondary squares and so on, but indeed was made up of this alternation, we could say, of built and unbuilt space, of which he thought that you would be able to wander through this. This was 1992. This is what Ito was suggesting in models. Here you see the park. Here you see this new area, which we call the New South area, with its strip-like urbanity and its porosity, we could say as well. These are some of the plans that Ito still was drawing. And then again, about 20 years later, Paola Vigano and Bernardo Secchi, but at the end only Paola Vigano, developed this New South area. The park would be developed here. I will show you in a moment. This is this New South area. And when we look very carefully, we see this idea of public spaces and urbanity that is organized in this strip-like formula, be it not in the low-rise formula, but indeed now allowing for high-rise towers to emerge there as well. But nevertheless, alternating between hard, fossil spaces, as you see here, and green, open spaces, as you see here, from one moment to the other, if you go through this area. Also, Ito's idea of a park was also realized very recently, only finished a few months ago, to be very honest, but developed as a design between 2017 and 2019 with a whole group of architects, amongst others, Georges Descombes, where indeed now this area of these old docks full of parking spaces is now turned into a public park for the citizens, giving, of course, this area, again, you can see from the urban fabric, this was one of these 19th century areas, a whole new spirit, I would say. Urban public space, not as a matter of lighthouse projects, but as indeed an idea of creating a sort of new weave between the built and the unbuilt, I would say. A third big project, also photographed and can be seen in the exhibition, was indeed the project of the quays. The quays, of course, were along the river Scheldt, which you see here. And this was developed by Manuel de Solá Morales, a Portuguese office ProAP, and a Belgian office WIT. Again, this was the way that they would have found the case in the early 1990s, full of cars, really a sort of in-between, between the city to the right-hand side and the river to the left-hand side, something that, of course, many cities were dealing with at the time. Again, full of parking, but nevertheless spaces that were still practiced by the citizens of Antwerp, to sit in the sun, as you can see here, to take a walk, or to just enjoy the fresh air of the river Scheldt. And then again, this whole strip, which is a strip from about 6 kilometers long, was reconsidered out of an idea of flood protection with a public waterfront, and developed out of an idea of a sort of modular approach, as you can see here. Always, on the one hand, dealing with a part of the module which was green, full of trees and grass, the sides more to the city, and another part which can be flooded when the tide is high, or there is a special climatological condition. So a planted park-like side towards the city, and a paved sacrificial part, as we call it, towards the river. Now, understanding indeed this case, or this old public space, harbor public space, as a sort of in-between term. An in-between term between city and river, an in-between term between the green space and a sacrificial space. But of course, also incorporated much needed infrastructure, such as parking infrastructure within this case as well. Here you see some of the renderings, the original ideas, and here relations between the city center. This is a representation of the cathedral, and this case, which would be located Another important part, and which is also certainly to be seen in the photography that you will see in the exhibition, was this part, the so-called Spoor North, and this was one of these huge yards for the railroad track yards. Railroad track yards, which was indeed replanned and redesigned by the office of Secchi Vigano, Bernardo Secchi and Paola Vigano. Indeed, a 24 hectares large site, an enormous site, which by now is in the middle of the city, I would say. and which I already showed before, but just to remind you of this vast site, a site that was in some kind of way cut by several infrastructures. This is a road, this is another road, and here you see how this site was cut and sort of superimposed by various road infrastructures as well. And what Zeki and Vigano were suggesting is to look upon this site as a big infrastructure, I would say, for the city, a park infrastructure for the city, a void infrastructure of the city, where the challenge was to build as little as possible. The brown parts that you see here, these are the build parts, and all the rest of the vast site that you see here are indeed largely open parts. So working with this site as an infrastructure, with this huge site, these huge public spaces that were there on the forend, as an infrastructure for the city, preserving traces of the railroad's past by preserving materials that were already on the site, cobblestones, certain bridges and infrastructures which we saw which we will see in the photography as well, and using all of these elements to indeed create an infrastructure that connects several parts of the city in new ways. What does it mean to create a new public space as a big infrastructure? Creating large surfaces that are not pre-planned, but that can be appropriated and used by the citizens of Antwerp in a variety of ways. So big lawns, big plazas, big paths, as you can see here as well. Very generous, but almost unprogrammed, you could say as well. And then indeed letting appropriation play its role, or indeed keeping large infrastructures in terms of buildings that were already on the site. Here you see the so-called park loads, which functions as a sort of year-round covered public space, a very welcomed public space in a city like Antwerp, where rain is not a scarce good. It's always used for playing, as which indeed creates new connections through the city. An infrastructure, we could say, both spatially, but I would also say certainly socially, this played a very important role, particularly in connecting these 19th century parts of the city that are so central in the photo exhibition, as you will see as well. Here you see some of these 19th century parts, and the park is really a sort of connector to other parts of the city as well, in some kind of way creating very, very new spaces, working with the already existing infrastructures and letting them be, but in some kind of way going along these infrastructures in order to create a new sort of connector, which, for instance, connects the 19th century city to 20th century social housing, to then at the head of the park, new buildings that are a bit more middle class buildings as well. I want to move to a last example in which I want to show a bit indeed how once again, how this urban policy and this idea of how to work with these vast public spaces that are related or were previously related to the harbor forged new attitudes in urban design. And I'm taking you one more time back to the area of the islet, and particularly to the very, very northern part of the islet, actually the part that is a bit below the text box. And this is the so-called droogdokken site, a site that is indeed, where I think indeed now public space is understood as a sort of landscape of coexistence, I would say. Here again, the droogdokken site, developed by Van Belle and Medina and Vogt landscape architects from here in Switzerland, Zurich amongst others. They were proposing this new design. A design that in some kind of way takes the articulation of the harbor landscape for granted. Here you see these dry docks, some of the docks that I showed before, you might remember from before in some of the images. And the idea is here very simply that these dry docks, they are fully respected as what is this zone, which was a sort of nondescript zone to start with. And here you see how indeed, on the one hand, this area is understood as a buffer zone. A buffer zone, again, that can be flooded whenever there is high tide. A buffer zone that, when there is low tide, that can be used as a park-like public space for leisurely use, we could say as well, but also a sort of new public park. On the one hand, the buffer zone, but on the other hand, the public park, which will now also extend amongst these dry docks. Dry docks that are on the one hand will be used as they were always used for the reparation of ships, so keeping some production in the middle of the city and keeping production as part of this new public space. But on the other hand, dry docks that will also be used for leisurely activities, for events, for meetings, for gatherings, for artistic projects. So a sort of combination, a new urban landscape, which largely relies on the articulations that are already there, but combines, on the one hand, a productive understanding of the city, boat building, boat repairing, with a leisurely understanding and a cultural understanding of the city as well, all within these dry docks. This brings me already to the end of my talk today, and I'm bringing you back to my initial image, the image which I opened. And I hope that in my short talk of today, I illustrated how the inheritance of this large-scale infrastructure of the harbor of Antwerp propelled in the 1990s what I would call the emergence of a new urban design culture in the city, which, besides the fact that it worked through very concrete projects, as you could see, I mean, I've shown you some of these concrete projects, also had a very, very specific emphasis on public space and on the rethinking of the variety of public spaces that we need in the city of the late 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. In the decades after the 1990s initiative of Stad aan de Stroom, the urban design in the city would, in my opinion, or in my view, be a sort of constant exploration, or do I dare to say struggle, with this question of public space. Interpreting public space as an urban network, as an urban weave, as an in-between space, as an infrastructure, or as a landscape of coexistence, as we saw in the last example. I think that it's exactly these multiple attempts, successful and unsuccessful, to think about the character and role of public space that makes a city as Antwerp so interesting, and possibly also, I think, the photographic exhibition so interesting. Until today, this question of public space remains a very, very big challenge for the city of Antwerp. And I think it's therefore also one of the key aspects that transpires in the photographic exhibition that we're going to look at in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there some additions to make? I have one, because thank you for understanding much better. Whoever has been to Antwerp, all people I know, they start to love it. And more and more I understand why, because it has a dimension that we don't have in Switzerland. I think that's one thing that fascinates us. All these harbor dimensions, I mean, it's just like, And I thank you very much for introducing these photographies about this history. Thank you very much for the work of taking these pictures for, in 1993 and in 2023. And thank you for explaining our history and the struggles, and also this not knowing what is perfect, but always trying to go on and add new functions or philosophies into the public spaces or in the everyday life.